My name is Avon. I was 32, juggling 3 brutal jobs, and still scraping together subway fare the exact week I discovered my grandfather had been wiring me a fortune every single month for 5 years. $8,000 a month by the time the whole charade collapsed. That is $96,000 a year, enough to change my entire reality. But instead, I never laid eyes on a single penny. I want you to understand that I wasn't just poor. I was exhausted to my very bones. Every hour of my day was accounted for, traded for a few dollars just to survive another week. I spent my days restoring crumbling historical facades, pulled graveyard shifts as a museum security guard, and taught an evening ceramics class just to keep the lights on. My hands were perpetually stained with mortar dust and clay. My back ached constantly, and I lived on discounted granola bars, and I still hunted for loose change in my couch cushions before the first of the month. I had been sinking so completely, so silently, that no one sitting around our family dining table expected me to ever open my eyes. So when my grandfather beamed at his own retirement jubilee and asked if my investment portfolio was treating me well, I nearly swallowed my own tongue. What my mother did with that cash was beyond greed. It was sickening. The paperwork she forged to keep the pipeline flowing was an outright felony. Welcome back to Shattered Glaze, where we broadcast the untold realities of women who stop absorbing the blame and start dismantling the lies, one forged signature at a time. No screaming matches, no theatrical breakdowns, just the cold, mechanical snap of the truth finally catching the light. If you prefer a steady voice and a well-deserved reckoning, leave a comment and hit subscribe.
If you are the one who always points out the rot in your family tree, you know how quickly they hand you the axe. You get punished for seeing what everyone else desperately wants to ignore. Adrenaline is a deceptive chemical. It numbs you right up until the crisis breaks. I dropped to my knees beside Zyler. I checked his pulse, pressed the back of my hand against his cheek. He felt clammy, dangerously parched. When I pinched the skin on his forearm, it lacked elasticity. No visible bleeding, no broken bones. I grabbed a wool throw from the floor, the only item ignored by the intruders, and bundled him up. I carried him to the kitchen island. "Slow swallows," I told him. "Just wet your mouth." He drank from the faucet like he had forgotten what water tasted like. While he perched on the granite counter, I finally dialed dispatch and laid out the facts. Unattended minor, missing homeowners, vandalized property. This was not a random break-in. The television remained bolted to the drywall. An expensive tablet sat entirely untouched on the windowsill. Whoever ripped this house apart did not want pawnable electronics. They wanted paper trails. The heavy steel filing cabinet in my father's den was completely mangled, pried apart by sheer force. Folders lay gutted on the hardwood. I nudged a few with my boot. Bank statements, property deeds, life insurance policies. They were hunting for leverage. I found a stack of sticky notes and a stray blue pen. I placed them next to Zyler's hands. He immediately began sketching. Heavy, dark circles. He did not ask for his mother or my parents. This kid knew exactly how to vanish inside his own head. The local deputies showed up 10 minutes later. I gave them the rundown. A child protective worker arrived shortly after, looking exhausted, and asked if I could serve as an emergency foster placement. I agreed before the woman even finished her sentence. Zyler never lifted his gaze from the blue circles. I drove him back to my tiny apartment in a foggy harbor town 30 miles south. It is a bleak space. 1 bedroom, bare walls,
mostly expired condiments in the fridge. I managed to scrape together a grilled cheese. He fell asleep leaning against the armrest before finishing his second bite. I sat at my cramped dining table and pulled up my call logs. 18 outgoing calls to my mother over the last week. Every single one went to voicemail after 5 rings. That meant her device was charged. She saw my face flash on the screen. She actively ignored me. I knew the rhythm of that silence. I grew up in that sprawling house. My father ran logistics for a shipping firm. My mother managed a botanical garden. We looked like the quintessential suburban success story, but appearances rot quickly under pressure.
I joined the military right out of high school. I did not flee an abusive home. I simply craved the gravity of my own consequences. 5 years of service, mostly stationed in rough waters, pulling reckless boaters from the abyss. When I returned to civilian life, I stuck with the water. The ocean makes sense. It tries to kill you honestly. My older brother, Wrighton, was a different species entirely. He was a brilliant software architect, pulling down ridiculous money by age 22. Then, a severe car accident shattered his spine. He lost his lucrative contracts, developed a brutal dependency on synthetic painkillers, and started dabbling in underground crypto syndicates to maintain his lifestyle. By the time I caught the scent of the disaster, my parents were drowning with him. The last genuine conversation I shared with my mother happened a month before I pulled Zyler from that closet. She called on a Tuesday. We discussed offshore weather patterns, her greenhouse, entirely mundane garbage. She casually mentioned Wrighton was doing phenomenal, securing new investments. Her pitch went up an octave on the word phenomenal. I pretended not to hear the lie. They had been hemorrhaging money for half a decade. I only ever got the scraps of the narrative. A sudden loan here, a downgraded vehicle there. My mother possessed a terrifying gift for packaging absolute ruin as a minor inconvenience. It began with the physical therapy. Wrighton's medical bills piled up. My parents drained their retirement to cover his initial treatments. That was justifiable. Your child breaks his back, you pay to fix it. But a year later, Wrighton was not writing code. He was glued to multiple monitors, gambling on obscure digital assets, convincing himself he could outsmart illegal offshore exchanges. The first major fallout was $50,000. He showed up at my parents' porch at dawn, claiming dangerous men were tracking his IP address. My mother emptied their emergency fund. She lied and told me they were remodeling the kitchen. When I asked about the lack of renovations months later, she told me he just needed a temporary lifeline. That phrase became a disease. 2 years passed. The debt ballooned to $250,000. My father leveraged the house, supposedly paying off Wrighton's handlers while keeping a fraction for their own survival. My mother secretly sold inherited antique jewelry. I bought her excuses because I was dangling from helicopters 50 hours a week and lacked the emotional capacity to interrogate her. 3 years ago, I orchestrated a formal intervention. I hired a specialist named Dr. Olena, an expert in high-stakes addiction. She warned me that without a united front, the addict simply walks. I promised her my parents were on board. I was an idiot. My mother warned Wrighton beforehand. He showed up late, stared blankly at Dr. Olena, and turned to me. "You abandoned us," he sneered.
He looked at our mother, told her he would handle things, and walked straight out the door. He drove off in a luxury sedan registered to an offshore shell company. Dr. Olena gave me a look of pure pity. She told me my brother would weaponize my mother's protection forever. She was spot on. I looked into involuntary holds. The laws were pathetic. You cannot lock someone up for destroying their family's financial existence. Unless Wrighton asked for help, the state viewed it as a personal choice. My mother coddled him, insisting I was too harsh, too rigid. The year before I found Zyler, my own life fractured, small cracks splitting the foundation. My weekly check-ins with my mother devolved into shouting matches. If I brought up Wrighton, she iced me out. She accused me of interrogating them instead of loving them. I warned her they would lose the house. She hung up on me and went silent for months. My husband Theron packed his bags during that freezing silence. The dawn light stripped away any shadows my parents' house had left to hide behind. I drove back to the property the morning after I pulled Zyler from the wreckage. Sunlight sliced through the shattered plantation shutters, illuminating dust motes dancing over the gutted living room. It looked infinitely worse in the daylight. Heavy oak cabinet doors were brutally snapped off their iron hinges. Along the corridor, framed memories hung crookedly or lay crushed on the floorboards. I stepped over a photograph from a coastal trip we took years ago. Wrighton was 10, I was 15. The glass was splintered directly across his smiling face. I stepped out onto the front porch to breathe and almost collided with Ondine. She had lived on the adjacent lot for 3 decades. 72 years old, widowed, and a former trauma ward supervisor at the regional hospital. She possessed the razor-sharp instinct of someone who processed tragedies for a living and never spoke unless she had absolute certainty. After that violent Tuesday, Ondine had watched the property closely. The kitchen bulb stayed burning for 2 days straight, she explained, her voice steady. I assumed your parents were simply too frightened to come outside. I left a paper sack of groceries right there on the welcome mat. Crackers, almond butter, some electrolyte drinks. She had unknowingly sustained a 4-year-old hiding in a utility space. I mentally logged every detail of the vehicle she described. Matte black, lifted suspension, an illegally modified exhaust that rattled the windows. Wrighton did not drive anything remotely like that. I thanked Ondine and walked back through the violated house, heading straight for the attached garage. The heavy metal door was wedged open. Beside my father's overturned tool bench, a plastic industrial chemical jug lay discarded on the cracked concrete.
The metallic, toxic stench I noticed yesterday was pungent now, biting the back of my throat. Someone had casually drenched the perimeter in accelerant. Detective Corin from the county precinct finally returned my frantic messages later that afternoon. His tone was infuriatingly measured, the voice of a man desensitized to broken families. "We processed the missing persons report," Corin stated, "but there is zero indication of forced entry from the exterior and no biological evidence of an assault. The interior damage points to a severe domestic altercation. They likely fled on their own accord."
I knew exactly what the detective was implying. Law enforcement does not launch massive manhunts for grown adults who abandon their own property. I forcefully explained the abandoned child, the Child Protective Services paperwork, the matte black SUV, and the chemical accelerant. Corin sighed, promising to assign a junior officer to look into it. I ended the call, sat in the suffocating heat of my car, and dialed Cable. We ran together in the military. He was a tactical communications specialist. Now, he operated a private bounty and skip tracing firm out of the city. If anyone had access to restricted registries, it was Cable. I gave him the profile. Matte black SUV, heavy modifications, roaming residential streets late at night. "Give me 12 hours, Cable said. He called me back just before 10 that night, while Zylar was passed out on my sofa under a thin quilt. Cable did not mince words. "The guy's name is Vane. You do not want to cross his path, Aaron." Cable outlined the nightmare. Vane operated an upscale asset liquidation front downtown. Clean licenses, flawless tax records. But in the back rooms, he bankrolled desperate addicts who had drained their familial resources. Vane was not a street thug. He did not break ribs or smash knees. He utilized relentless, calculated psychological terror. He stalked his victims, parking his massive vehicle outside their bedroom windows at 3 in the morning, making silent, suffocating threats.
"He doesn't have to lay a finger on anyone," Cale explained, his voice grim over the line. "The people he corners are already paralyzed by their own bad decisions. Vane just exploits the panic." I asked the only question that mattered. How deep was Wrighton buried? Cale paused. "If Vane is personally visiting the property, your brother's debt is catastrophic. He doesn't leave the office for loose change." The following afternoon, I drove into the industrial district to confirm the nightmare. I parked 2 blocks away from Vane's liquidation front, watching the reinforced glass doors from the safety of my vehicle. I did not storm the building. You do not dive into a rip current without analyzing the water first. Within 10 minutes, the matte black SUV rolled into the private alleyway. Ondine's description was flawless. My grip on the steering wheel turned my knuckles white. Staring at that vehicle dragged my mind back to a sterile supermarket aisle 8 months ago. I had accidentally run into Wrighton in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. He looked skeletal, clutching a basket full of high-caffeine energy drinks. His cheekbones were hollow, his skin pale and slick with a cold sweat. He smiled brightly when he...
I drafted a blunt text to my father's mobile. "I know about the second mortgage. I don't care about the money. Zylar is safe in my apartment. Tell me where you are." I stared at the illuminated screen. The notification flipped to delivered. 10 seconds later, the read receipts appeared. Complete silence. I sent a second message. Where is Mom's jewelry? Read. Ignored. I sat paralyzed in my kitchen, absorbing the weight of their refusal to speak. At the island counter, Zyler was furiously scribbling on a notepad. Providing him with blank paper was the only action that anchored him to reality. He sketched identical obsessive scenes, a gray, square building with a steeply pitched roof, devoid of any windows or doors. Two towering figures stood frozen on the lawn, arms pinned to their sides. I softly asked him who the people were. Zyler barely shrugged. Just them. A structure with no entry point. Two adults barricaded out, or a child trapped within. That evening, over a bowl of lukewarm soup, Zyler's dam finally broke. It was not a tearful confession, just fractured sentences dropped into the quiet room. Nana cried a lot, he murmured, tracing the rim of his bowl. Before the loud truck man came, I stopped breathing, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed so I wouldn't spook him. What happened when he came, Zyler? I asked softly. I drafted a blunt text to my father's mobile. I know about the second mortgage. I don't care about the money. Zyler is safe in my apartment. Tell me where you are. I stared at the illuminated screen. The notification flipped to delivered. 10 seconds later, the read receipts appeared. Complete silence. I sent a second message. Where is Mom's jewelry? Read. Ignored. I sat paralyzed in my kitchen, absorbing the weight of their refusal to speak. At the island counter, Zyler was furiously scribbling on a notepad. Providing him with blank paper was the only action that anchored him to reality. He sketched identical obsessive scenes, a gray, square building with a steeply pitched roof, devoid of any windows or doors. Two towering figures stood frozen on the lawn, arms pinned to their sides. I softly asked him who the people were. Zyler barely shrugged. Just them. A structure with no entry point. Two adults barricaded out, or a child trapped within. That evening, over a bowl of lukewarm soup, Zyler's dam finally broke. It was not a tearful confession, just fractured sentences dropped into the quiet room. Nana cried a lot, he murmured, tracing the rim of his bowl. Before the loud truck man came, I stopped breathing, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed so I wouldn't spook him. What happened when he came, Zyler? I asked softly.
I watched him recognize his own handwriting. For a fraction of a second, he smiled, that instinctive warmth reserved for someone you deeply love. Then I told him, "Turn it over, Grandpa." He flipped the paper. On the back was my name, Avon Caldwell, signed in an elegant, looping script that was absolutely not mine, endorsing a deposit into an account I had never seen. He stared at it for an agonizingly long time, his thumb traced over the forged signature as if he could physically feel the lie. "That is not your handwriting," he stated finally. It was not a question. "No," I confirmed quietly. "I have never seen a single dollar of this money. Not once in 5 years." His hand began to tremble, but his eyes remained dry, hardening with every passing second. Moving slowly, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a worn card, the kind you keep close because it holds meaning. He set it down directly next to the cleared check. The handwriting on the thank you note matched the forged endorsement perfectly, loop for loop. "You mailed me this," he whispered, "for my last birthday. I keep it with me." I stared at a heartfelt note I had never written, signed by a thief using my name. "I didn't, Grandpa," I told him. "I didn't even know you were giving me anything to be thankful for." I sat there and watched 5 years of a manufactured reality shatter behind his eyes. I left Zyler with Ondine the following morning. Child Protective Services had officially cleared the former trauma nurse as a temporary guardian, a rapid approval process that felt like a tiny sliver of mercy. I drove straight back to the gutted property. The garage felt like a tomb, the stench of chemical accelerant still hanging thick in the stale air. I headed straight for the unlit corner Zyler had mentioned. Beneath a crumbling wooden workbench, obscured by dried buckets of sealant, sat a heavy, fireproof lockbox. It was secured by a 4-digit mechanical dial. I knelt on the cold concrete and spun the wheels. I tried my father's birth year. The latch held firm. I tried my mother's anniversary. Nothing. I knelt in the shadows of a home ruined by unconditional, toxic love, wondering what numbers a desperate man uses to guard his final secrets. I spun the dial. To my own birth date, October 12th, 1012. The heavy steel clasp snapped open with a hollow click. He hadn't used Wrighton's numbers. He used mine. Inside lay a thick bundle of pawn shop transfer documents, bound by a frayed elastic band. Every single slip was stamped by Vane's liquidation firm. The top receipt. The formal demand letter went out on Kaylee Vance's heavy bond paper, bearing Aldous' signature. Then came the agonizing phase no one warns you about. The wait. Major banks do not cough up 5 years of transaction records overnight. So I did the only thing I was trained to do. I went back to my grueling shifts and acted completely normal, because tipping them off now would destroy the element of surprise. Oriana texted me about the floral arrangements, complaining about the color palette and the budget constraints, and I replied with the breezy tone of a sister who suspected nothing. Lysandra called to remind me to dress appropriately for once in my life. I promised her I would. In restoration work, there is a distinct moment when you stop trying to fix the crumbling structure and start meticulously documenting the decay, because the paper trail is the only thing that protects you when the building finally collapses and the owners demand someone to blame. That was exactly my mindset. I remained flawlessly calm on the outside, while building a dossier that no amount of weeping could dismantle. One verified document at a time. If you have ever been forced to remain the stable foundation while everyone around you rewrites reality to suit themselves, you already know the crushing patience this requires. I locked myself in a janitorial closet under flickering fluorescent lights and opened the encrypted file Kaylee sent. It was all there. 5 years of systemic theft documented in high resolution. Check after check. The front bore my grandfather's distinct scrawl. The back featured the name Avon Caldwell, signed in that identical, looping forgery from his wallet. Every single payment had been deposited via mobile capture directly into a joint checking account held by Oriana and Kaylin. Kaylin had orchestrated the routing. Oriana had forged my signature. It was clinical, complete, and legally devastating. It would have been more than enough. But Kalia had warned me there was more, and the more is what made me physically sick. The endorsement images were just the beginning. Aldis's disbursements were managed by an external accounting firm, and his authorization forced them to surrender their entire correspondence file alongside the financial records. Buried within those records were letters the family had supposedly sent over the years, updates, requests, thank you notes. Several of them were written by me in that same fabricated handwriting. One letter, dated 3 years ago, asked Aldis to increase the monthly stipend from $6,000 to $8,000. The justification? Avon wants to go back for her master's in architectural history, and the tuition is incredibly steep. I had never penned those words. I had never begged that man for a dime. Someone had weaponized my identity and my grandfather's genuine affection to negotiate a raise on their theft. That was the exact second the situation mutated. Stealing cash was a deep wound.
That evening, I faced a massive decision. I could hand the entire file to Kalia, file the civil suits quietly, let the lawyers grind it out, and never utter a word at the upcoming gala. It would be infinitely cleaner. It would be significantly safer. A huge part of me, the part conditioned over 32 years to avoid conflict at all costs, craved that clean exit. But I had watched Lysandra manipulate the narrative for too long to believe that silence offered any real safety. If I initiated this behind closed doors, she would immediately seize control of the story. She would tell the extended family I had become deranged and greedy. She would claim I viciously attacked a struggling widow over a minor administrative error. She would rewrite my character just as effortlessly as she forged my name. The absolute only way to protect the truth was to deliver it myself, out loud, in front of every single person who would otherwise consume her poisoned version first. So I called Kalia and finalized the plan. The criminal report and the restitution demands would move through the legal system on their own rigid timeline. But the confrontation, the precise moment the family discovered they were caught, would happen at that dining table, in front of those specific guests. It was the only room Lysandra couldn't edit. I am not doing this to hurt them, I told Kalia, meaning every word. I am doing it so they can never do it to me again. She remained quiet for a moment before offering one crucial piece of advice. Bring exactly what you need, Avon. Slapping down 100 pages looks like a hysterical vendetta. Dropping 3 undeniable checks looks like the cold, hard truth. I wrote her advice down. 48 hours until the gala.
In the 2 days leading up to the gala, my family did what they always did. They inadvertently made my decision easier. Oriana posted a lavish video on her social media, flaunting an absurdly expensive vintage timepiece she had surprised Aldis with for his birthday. A watch that cost more than I earned in 6 months of manual labor. A watch funded, I now realized, entirely by his own intercepted money. Her caption read, "Family is absolutely everything." I stared at the post until the last shred of my hesitation burned away completely. Then, Lysandra called with her final set of demands. "Wear something elegant, Avon," she commanded. "Not your usual depressing rags. This is your grandfather's milestone. Do not make it gloomy. Do not make this about you." I almost laughed out loud. For 5 agonizing years, they had funded. The afternoon of the gala, I arrived early to set up the floral installations.
I found Lysandra sitting alone at her massive marble kitchen island, and for a terrifying second, my resolve nearly cracked. She didn't notice me walk in. She was staring blankly at a pile of past due notices, the glaring red font of a final foreclosure warning visible on top. Her expensive reading glasses were pushed up into hair that had gone much grayer than she usually allowed people to see. She looked incredibly old. She looked exhausted in a way that went far deeper than party planning stress. She looked like someone who was actively losing everything. For one breath, I didn't see the architect of a 5-year felony. I just saw my mother, drowning in her own self-made disaster. The part of me programmed to forgive her flared up hard. She looked up, saw me standing there, and didn't even try to cover the bills. "You have absolutely no idea what it feels like," she murmured, almost to herself. "To stand here and lose the home your father built. I couldn't let it slip away. I just couldn't." For a split second, I almost folded. I almost told her we could deal with it later, that I understood the panic. Then I remembered freezing in my car, counting out coins for gas, while she protected her real estate with my stolen money. I remembered 5 birthdays where she told me not to be dramatic. An hour before the first guests arrived, Aldous found me in the empty dining hall. We ran through the strategy one final time. 2 conspirators in formal wear. He had executed his part flawlessly. He had invited his oldest friend and personal attorney, a sharp, observant man named Silas, to attend as a regular guest. It broke no social rules, but it guaranteed there was a legal expert in the room who understood exactly what the documents meant and could verify them if the situation escalated. "Silas is just enjoying his steak," Aldous muttered, "until he needs to stop." I clutched my slim folder. I had taken Kaylee's advice seriously. I was not going to dump 5 years of bank logs onto the linen tablecloth like an unstable person throwing a tantrum. I had extracted 3 specific checks, showing the front and the endorsed back. The cleanest, most undeniable examples of the forgery. Not enough to look chaotic, but impossible to ignore. The rest of the evidence, including those sickening letters, remained hidden in reserve. "I didn't bring the whole box," I told him. "Just enough." Aldous looked at the thin folder, then up at my face. A profound mix of pride and deep sorrow crossed his features. "Your father would have handled it exactly like this," he said quietly. "Precise. Ruthless. Once." I had to look at the ceiling to keep from crying before the war even started. He gripped my shoulder tight. "After the main toast," he instructed, "I will ask you the usual question. The check question. You take the floor from there." It was the most brutal, brilliant piece of the entire strategy. The warm, generic line he had asked me 100 times, the exact phrase Lysandra had spent half a decade desperately interrupting, would be the trigger that finally blew the room apart. The heavy brass doorbell chimed. The first guests were walking in. I smoothed down my charcoal blazer and walked out to greet my family with a perfect, hollow smile. I need to rewind to the night before the gala, because I almost talked myself out of the entire plan. I think it's important to admit that even the strong ones waver. I called Alara, the senior restoration architect who trained me, the closest thing I had to a mother who didn't lie to my face. I spilled the entire story in a panicked rush while sitting in my car outside a convenience store. When I finally stopped talking, she let the silence hang. Then she delivered the exact reality check I needed. "Martyrdom is not a career path, Avon," she said sharply. "Neither is suffering in silence." I admitted I was terrified, not of Oriana's rage or Lysandra's tears, but of becoming the villain they would inevitably paint me as.
the unstable daughter who detonated the family for cash at an old man's celebration. "What if I am the one who destroys us?" I asked, my voice cracking. Alara didn't hesitate. "Honey, they destroyed the family 5 years ago. You weren't breaking anything." She let that sink in before finishing the thought. "You are just turning on the flood."
The gala was visually stunning. I will give them that. Aldis's massive dining hall glowed under the crystal chandeliers and the elaborate floral installations I had built. The air was thick with the scent of expensive food and expensive perfume. 16 people were seated around the sprawling table. Aunts, wealthy cousins, 2 of his original business partners, and Silas, the attorney, quietly sipping scotch near the head. Oriana floated around the room in a designer gown, playing the perfect hostess for an event she funded with my stolen security. Kaylin was busy pouring vintage wine, laughing loudly, completely unaware the ground beneath him was about to vanish. Lysandra sat to Aldis's immediate right, occupying her usual throne as the devoted, capable daughter who handled everything. I sat near the far end, my charcoal blazer sharp against the silk chairs, the slim folder resting casually in my lap. I made polite conversation. I complimented Oriana on the imported truffles. I watched my family radiate charm and fake warmth, deeply convinced of their own superiority. I realized that to every single one of them, this was just another flawless evening. That was the bizarre, isolating power I held. I was the only person in the room who knew we were dining inside an active crime scene. Silverware clinked against fine china. A cousin laughed at a joke near the head of the table. The jazz quartet my sister hired played softly in the background. Aldis caught my eye exactly once and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Then he tapped his heavy crystal glass with a silver spoon. The sharp ring sliced through the...
I drove my father to the precinct in silence. He stared out the passenger window at the gray morning. "I should have stopped this years ago," he murmured. I didn't offer him any absolution. In Corin's office, my father sat before a recording device and finally told the truth. He detailed 5 years of financial hemorrhage, the pawned heirlooms, the forced loans. He described Vane's escalating intimidation tactics. He recounted the violence of Tuesday night, the demand for the property deed, and the 48-hour ultimatum. My father signed the official affidavit without a tremor in his hand. The cowardice that ruled him for years vanished the moment he put pen to paper. Corin outlined the reality. "I am submitting charges to the district attorney today. Elder exploitation, a severe felony, criminal coercion, and regarding Zyler, felony child endangerment." Corin looked at me. "The warrants will be active within 48 hours. Do not engage with your brother or Vane under any circumstances." I nodded, walked out of the precinct, and drove straight to the courthouse to file the final paperwork for emergency guardianship of Zyler. The net was closing.
The family attorney reviewed my guardianship application, along with my father's sworn statement. If the district attorney formally charges him, the courts will grant this immediately, she assured me. Everything was tightening into a neat snare, except my mother had handed Wrighton a massive head start, and I had zero idea how he would spend it. Ondine called my cell late that afternoon. Her voice was clipped, carrying the icy control of a woman accustomed to pronouncing times of death. "Aaron, the matte black SUV, it just crawled past your parents' property twice in the last 40 minutes, barely idling." I ordered her to deadbolt everything. "I haven't left my living room since Tuesday," she replied flatly. I immediately phoned Corin. The warrant was still grinding through a judge's desk. 24 hours minimum. I sped back to my apartment. My father, Silas, sat rigidly at the tiny dining table, a mug of black coffee growing cold between his hands. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "I didn't tell Corin everything," Silas rasped. I froze. Wrighton promised Vane the deed to the house. He made that guarantee before he even asked your mother for it. Vane fronted him an additional $20,000 based on that lie. Wrighton vaporized the cash in 4 days. The math hit me like a physical blow. Vane wasn't just chasing 50 grand. He was buried over 70. And a predator like Vane does not swallow a $70,000 deficit.
Vane would redistribute that deficit, and the only people left with any assets were my parents or me. "They are coming here tonight," I stated. It wasn't a guess. Silas nodded miserably. "Your mother told him your address." "Of course she did." I spent the next 2 hours stripping the board. I called Cale first. "I need Alara and Xylar at your secure facility tonight. 0 paper trail. Can you handle it?" Cale didn't even pause. "Back door is open. Bring them." Next, I shoved Xylar's meager belongings into a duffel bag. Spare clothes, his plastic dinosaur, the sketchbook he obsessed over. I knelt down and told him he was having a sleepover at a friend's place. He accepted the relocation with the chilling, silent obedience of a child used to sudden evacuations. Alara blocked the hallway as I carried the duffel out. "What are you doing? This is hysterical, Aaron. Wrighton would never—" I drove them across the city to Kyle's compound. Alara sat in the passenger seat, gripping Xylar's hand, staring out the window without uttering a single syllable. Once I dropped them off, I called Detective Corin. "If Vane shows up at my door, how fast can you scramble a unit?" 15 minutes, Corin replied. "Make it 10. My apartment felt agonizingly hollow without Xylar's quiet breathing. The silence amplified the distant roar of the ocean crashing against the cliffs. Silas sat on the worn sofa. I leaned against the kitchen counter. "I am so sorry, Aaron," Silas finally whispered. His skin looked gray beneath the fluorescent bulb. "I knew your mother was destroying us. I felt it the first time she drained the savings account. You can feel the engine dying before it actually stalls." He rubbed his exhausted face. "But you have to understand her. Her own mother walked out when Alara was 12. Just packed a suitcase, boarded a train, and vanished to escape a violent husband. Alara swore to God she would never do that. She promised she would never abandon her own child." Silas looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Every time you forced her to look at Wrighton's addiction, all she heard was her mother telling her to run. She literally could not let him go." "You didn't protect your marriage by staying quiet, Dad," I said softly. "You just lost the whole family." Silas absorbed my words like a final judgment. We let the silence stretch for another hour. At 1:45, I stood by the sink, rinsing out his coffee mug. Then, I heard it. The heavy, aggressive thrum of an illegally modified diesel engine pulling into the visitor lot. Working rescue ops,
You never forget the acoustic signature of a specific motor. I killed the kitchen lights and slipped over to the blinds. The matte black SUV idled 3 spaces away from my sedan. The heavy doors popped open. Wrighton stepped out first, wearing a dark hoodie, his movements jerky and panicked. Behind him, Vane climbed out of the driver's seat. He wore a tailored coat, moving with the sluggish, terrifying confidence of a man who firmly believes consequences apply to other people. I dialed Corin immediately. They are in the parking lot. 2 targets. Building 4, Unit 4B. Units are 12 minutes out, Corin barked. Do not engage. Keep the door locked. I dropped the phone and walked to the spare bedroom. Silas was sitting rigidly on the mattress. Lock the door, Dad. Aaron! You signed the paper. Your part is done. I'll handle this. Silas swallowed hard, nodded, and pulled the door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place. I walked back to the entryway. The faint, nauseating scent of chemical accelerant seeped under the doorframe. Vane was carrying the same stench from my parents' garage. 3 soft knocks echoed through the apartment.
I unlatched the deadbolt and yanked the door open. Wrighton stood on the welcome mat, shivering despite the mild night. Vane lingered 3 paces behind him, leaning casually against the metal railing, obscured by the shadows. Aaron. Wrighton tried to inject authority into his voice, but it cracked. We need to come inside and talk. I stayed planted directly in the threshold. I didn't budge an inch. We can talk right here. Wrighton shot a desperate glance back at Vane, then refocused on me. Mom told me you're trying to lock me up. Look, just get Dad to sign the property deed over to Vane. Vane zeroes out the balance, I leave the state, you get Xylar, everyone walks away clean. The house doesn't hold enough equity to cover your catastrophic failures, I replied, keeping my voice deadpan. And I don't own the property. They ran because they refused to give your loan shark their retirement. Vane finally stepped out of the shadows. His voice was smooth, a quiet hum designed to terrify. Miss Aaron, I am strictly a businessman. Your brother breached a financial contract. I am simply here to collect what I am owed. Your family has the means to rectify this. You are a predator standing at my door at midnight, I snapped, leaning forward. You run an illegal extortion ring out of an asset liquidation. I raised my voice just enough to ensure the security camera above my door caught every syllable. Detective Corin has every single promissory note you forged. You are currently looking at felony extortion of a senior citizen. This isn't a business negotiation. You're trespassing. Vane's eyes narrowed into absolute slits. The calculated arrogance vanished. The math wasn't working in his favor anymore. Wrighton shattered completely. You always think you're untouchable, he screamed, spit flying from his lips. You abandoned us. I stayed here. They chose me over you. They didn't choose you, Wrighton, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. They just couldn't stop you. Wrighton lunged at me. Vane instantly clamped a massive hand onto his shoulder, ripping him backward. Vane knew the exact second Wrighton laid a hand on me, the extortion turned into violent assault. I stared at my brother, 28 years old, sweating, skeletal, completely hollowed out by his own poison. Red and blue strobes violently flooded the parking lot below. 3 cruisers boxed in the black SUV. They hauled them down the stairwell. Vane remained completely silent,
his face a mask of furious calculation. Wrighton openly wept. I shut my front door, resting my forehead against the cool wood. From the spare bedroom, the muffled sounds of my father finally breaking down echoed through the drywall. The next morning, I drove across the city to retrieve Zylar and Alara from Cale's compound. Cale met me at the reinforced gate, gave me a curt nod, and walked away. He knew when to give people space. Alara was sitting on a bench in the courtyard. Her thumb continuously rubbed the bare indent on her ring finger, a ghost habit she couldn't break. Silas had called her at dawn. She already knew about the arrest. I sat next to her. I didn't say a word. Working trauma teaches you that sometimes silence does the heavy lifting. My mother left us on a Tuesday, Alara whispered, staring at the concrete. My father was in a drunken rage. I was 12. I stood by the front window and watched her board a city bus. I promised myself I would rather die than abandon my own child. I thought if I just loved Wrighton fiercely enough, he would stop destroying himself. I thought my mother's problem was that she just didn't love me enough to stay. She turned to me, her eyes completely devoid of tears. I broke everything trying to fix him.
I looked at the woman who had pawned her heritage, lied to her husband, and left her 4-year-old grandson hiding in a barricaded closet, all to honor a promise made by a traumatized 12-year-old. "You aren't your mother, Alara," I said softly, reaching out to grip her hands. "You did the exact opposite, and the family's still shattered." She pulled a ragged breath into her lungs. "I know. I'm not demanding you stop loving him," I told her. "I'm asking you to love Zylar more than you fear losing Wrighton." She nodded weakly. She would try. She would probably stumble. That is the grim reality when the people you love are fractured on a cellular level. I walked inside the safe house. Zylar was sitting at a heavy steel table, hovering over a fresh notepad. He looked up at me, and for the first time in 10 days, the brutal tension around his jaw relaxed. He slid a piece of paper across the table. I picked it up. A gray house with a steeply pitched roof. But this time, the facade featured a massive open door. A tall figure stood in the threshold, reaching out to hold the hand of a much smaller figure. I folded the paper carefully and slid it into my jacket. "Let's go home, Zylar," I said. "For as long as you need." He grabbed my hand. His grip was fiercely strong.